Hello, welcome. To continue with the parade of non-stop events of this semester, it is my pleasure to introduce Marcelyn Gow. I always imagine that these lectures are very tricky for the person who have to do it when you have to lecture in the school and you teach, and in front of your colleagues, in front of your students. So I was trying to put together a couple of simple ideas about the work, to talk about the work of Marcelyn. I know her for a long time by now, and it has been very interesting to see the evolution of it. But there is one thing I want to point out, which is maybe an unusual way to talk about it in an academic context of the work of somebody, or there is something really, to me, really appealing between the difference between the personality and character of Marcelyn as a human being and the work that she does. Because, I mean, she's this super calm, sweet, smart person, and the work has this kind of a primitive, brutal, aggressive quality sometimes. So there is something really fascinating about that. And I think in many ways, Marcelyn is one of those rare architects who have the capacity to design and to think about design, but have the capacity to write and to theorize about the work. And this is not the common thread these days, less and less. And I think when you try to operate between those two territories, there's always some interesting confusion that start to happen. And so I was trying to figure it out, how she's trying to handle and how to try to navigate what I will call the current landscape of agencies of contamination that many of the people that we were brought under the umbrella of the computational era and so on. And I thought there maybe was a way to start to talk about in terms of the evolution of sophistication and the combination of what we call sophistication and high-end, low-end, and interests of dirtiness, or how you start to reconfigure things that we know, disciplinary values that we establish. And I think the work that Marcelyn has pursued with the different shapes and forms that Servo has taken over the years is related a little bit like that. This is, for those of you who don't know, is one of the dishes of Ferran Adrià. At first glance doesn't look exactly like food, but then when you taste it, the taste is not that different. And of course, there is that quality, but it's not just that the whole notion operates within that. There's also the kind of a tradition or the discipline, in this case will be Julia Childs, and how we start to navigate those relations between both of them. And this is a dish of Julia Childs, not the same thing, but I would argue that in many ways, many of the work that was done in the late 90s, early 2000s was trying to operate in the Ferran Adrià territory, but it seems to be that a lot of people, and I will try to include Marcelyn on that, and I think in the work that she's been doing to analog material experimentation that get rebuilt into the work of the digital domain, there is a little bit of Julia Childs trying to make way into Ferran Adrià. Now, to conclude, maybe there is a clip that I saw recently, which I think it could be, which also can introduce the dangers, but also the fascination and the fun that when we go all balls out in terms of experimentation it can have, where it can take us.
Yes, fish eaters, the days of troublesome scaling, cutting, and gutting are over, because Super Bassomatic 76 is the tool that lets you use the whole bass with no fish waste without scaling, cutting, or gutting. Here's how it works. Catch a bass, remove the hook, and drop the bass. That's the whole bass into the Super Bassomatic 76. Now adjust the control dial so that that bass is blended just the way you like it.
So, there is something really fascinating about where is the limit and how far we can go. And I cannot think of anybody better who tests those capacities in terms of where is the limit, where is the disciplinary knowledge, how the limits get tested based on how you understand the field in which you operate. So I'm very curious to see where the work is these days of Marcelyn. So without further ado, Marcelyn Gow.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Hernan for that really thoughtful introduction. I'm going to have to get one of those bass maker machines. That's fantastic. Also, on behalf of my partner in Servo Los Angeles, William Mohline, and our partner in Servo Stockholm, Ulrika Karlsson, we really want to thank Eric for the opportunity to lecture here tonight. And thank you all for coming. I know it's been a kind of parade of events in the recent weeks. Even today we've had several, so thank you. So as Hernan mentioned, yes, a big part of what I do is actually involving words. And I think that, really we cannot have discourse without words. So we need artifacts and words in order to produce our discourse. And I think in an academic context, it's essential. And I was thinking about it, that many of the things I write are actually, whoops, we have a blank screen here, are actually written for the context here at SCI-Arc in the form of what could be called gray literature. Gray literature refers to texts that are not published formally, but things like dissertations, documents, informal kinds of literature that are actually distributed amongst a small audience and are ephemeral in nature. And so that would include for me the studio brief, the seminar brief. When I think about how many of these I've actually written over the past 7 years or something, it's amazing. I mean, so a lot of what is on my mind, a lot of what I'm thinking about is coming out in that form. So I thought I would talk tonight about several tropes. A trope is the use of words in a way other than their literal meaning. So there's going to be a little bit of play on words here. And the first trope is abjection overruled, using the kind of reference to legal terminology, objection overruled, abjection overruled. So I'd like to read from something that is a kind of mashup of a current studio I'm teaching right now, the Vertical Studio, and a text that I wrote for an issue of On-Ramp that Florencia Pita and I edited, which was called Another Fine Mess. So in reference to, I begin with a quote by Yves Lambois on Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, which we see here. Bois says, quote, "Once submitted to gravity, once lowered into the contingent world of things and bodies, the sign does not hold water. It dissolves as an iterable sign and regresses toward singularity." So, end of quote, referring to the kind of obvious and sort of arbitrary nature of the measuring device, the fact that the kind of string in free fall submitting itself to gravity will produce something that is a very unique instance, and the kind of absurdity of translating that into a measuring device is what he's pointing out in this work. And so this relates to what I'm about to read to you. So we are interested in architectural acts of translation, advancing an understanding of how the shift from one mode of description to another produces gaps in apprehension that challenge what can be construed or misconstrued as either real or fictive. In contradistinction to either literal translation, the metaphrase, or parallel translation, the paraphrase, the work instead produces translations that attempt to render something with varying degrees of latitude, and to coalesce that rendition with its source. This relies on semblance, the appearance or outward seeming of something which is actually not there, or of which the reality is different from its appearance. The legible correlation between things inherent to the practice of architecture, between drawing and model, or between drawing and building, involves varying degrees of specificity. The exclusion of certain kinds of information and the inclusion of other kinds of information within a given format is driven by the conventions of architectural notation and what is considered to be germane or appropriate or even relevant to a particular context. Paradoxically, a degree of generalization is often required in the interest of enhancing legibility. The work challenges these conventions and considers how the presence of descriptive improprieties may yield formal improprieties and produce architectural objects that exist in multiple guises. This raises questions regarding the state of the eidetic image in relation to an object. It reflects on the idea that the capacity to describe an object may be such that the description of the object begins, in some instances, to coincide with the thing itself. The work scrutinizes the odd coupling of precision with inexactitude, advancing an understanding of the role of the analog in regard to contemporary aesthetics by considering the distinction between inexact forms, things that appear as if they are non-reproducible, and inexact processes, things that are in fact non-reproducible. An incongruous state of precise inexactitude may be engendered through contamination, whereby a process of delineation reveals discrepancies germane to the act of drawing itself, or particularities of geometry become compromised through translation from the digital to the analog realm. Liquefaction of the eye, liquefaction of the sky, and liquefaction of words. Ed Ruscha's viscous declensions of the term eye in his liquid words paintings and Georges Bataille's story of the eye both subject matter to radical transmutation. But the spill that captures Ruscha's eye is an accurately rendered spill, the contours of which are marked by the precise meeting of pigment and its receptive surface. Unlike the actual play of gravitational forces that directed viscous matter in its contact with a dirt hillside in Robert Smithson's glue pour, this fabricated spill involves virtuosity in the control of a specific medium towards the production of an illusion rather than a completely unbridled flow of matter. The image conjures an imaginary inverse process. This is the imaginary inverse process is also a quote from Yves Lambois. Not the drying out of words that have just been written, but the melting of the letters, their more or less slow fusion toward a state of indifferentiation, end of quote. Likewise, the objects in Bataille's story, chosen for their orbicular morphologies, are endowed with diverse material properties, allowing the eye to migrate through a series of objects having various consistencies ranging from luminous to liquefied, from the gelatinous quality of a soft-boiled egg to the creamy iridescence of a saucer of milk. The eye figure remains intact, but surfaces in various guises. In the universe Bataille constructs, these conjunctions between figure and materiality breed strains of fuzzy eye-like avatars that, despite their apparent misalignment, emerge as utterly plausible due to the craft exercised in coalescing physical properties of matter with things. Liquefaction, both in the painted words of Ruscha and Bataille's story, produces a state of indifferentiation that disrupts and tends toward the obliteration of discrete identities. As a process, it involves a shift from the precisely figured toward a more entropic state, approaching the abject. The abject, literally a derivative of the Latin to cast off or to jettison, was described by Julia Kristeva in her text Powers of Horror as the reaction to a loss of distinction between the self and that which is other. In his seminal text, Probable Geometries, Greg Lynn characterized the dichotomy between anexact and inexact form in architecture as follows. Quote, he says in the text, "The distinctions between exact, inexact, and anexact geometries, although seemingly esoteric, and this is written quite a while ago, are becoming critical to any discussion of new spatial organizations." 93, I believe. Husserl distinguishes exact forms as those that can be reduced eidetically, like the form of a sphere. They are not only precise, but can be reduced completely. Conversely, inexact forms are described as those figures that cannot be fixed or reduced because their contours cannot be described. I think it's kind of fascinating that you know, and I think perhaps my fascination with this is that I was a student of Greg Lynn's and taught with him for 3 years at the ETH while he was working through, you know, some of these issues related to the inexact, but for him, inexactitude was considered to be irrelevant to the architect because it was not something that one could handle. So a key point in the argument is the fact that forms whose contours cannot be delineated with precision are rendered useless, which I think we're in a different situation today, which is why I bring it up. And this is obviously the drawings, the diagrams of Greg Lynn's embryological house, which I think everyone's familiar with, but you know, one can see again the local degrees of precision with which those forms can be defined. This is a piece by Linda Benglis called Blatt, where I think it does address the issue of the inexact pretty clearly. The same sense of futility in the attempt to render inexactitude permeates a passage from the text Funes the Memorias by Jorge Luis Borges. Quote, "A circle drawn on a blackboard, a right triangle, a lozenge, all these are forms which we can fully and intuitively grasp. Ireneo could do the same with the stormy mane of a pony, with a herd of cattle on a hill, with a changing fire and its innumerable ashes, with the many faces of a dead man throughout a long wake," end of quote. The text is the story of a mind that draws and redraws ceaselessly the contours of every object and every space it imagines. Another piece by Linda Benglis called Quartered Meteor. Each encounter is recorded in full detail. In delineating the difficulty this poses to acts of translation between images and words or images and drawings, Borges' text also suggests the difficulties posed for architecture by the presence of inexact geometries and forms. So the inexact was contemporaneously to Lynn's text situated in Art Historical Discourse by Rosalind Krauss and Yves Lambois in Formless, A User's Guide, where Georges Bataille's definition of formless, that which obliterates discrete identities, is used to read modernism in art against the grain, via the terms horizontality, base materialism, pulse, and entropy, which counter the normal terms of verticality, stasis, to name a few. The consideration of the formless in art instigates a shift from the precisely figured toward an abject state where boundaries are obliterated, producing a loss of distinction and identities. Likewise, the current aesthetic proclivity in architecture for formal logics that do not instantly and unequivocally reveal the ordering systems underlying them suggests the contemporary relevance of the inexact for architecture. This work considers the potentials of the inexact broadly defined through acts of translation between specific mediums, questioning the assumed exactitude of digital processes by opening them up to unlikely conjunctions with less exact analog behaviors. The oxymoron precisely inexact points to an apparent irreconcilability. How can the inexact, defined as flawed, erroneous, or accurate, constitute something carefully delineated and correct? This becomes compounded when applied to architecture, where the architect's job has conventionally been that of, quote, giving geometric order to a state of disorder. So again, the contours describing something. So this is the person who talked about giving geometric order to a state of disorder, Kisho Noriaki, Kisho Kurokawa, his Metabolite Floating Factory from 1969. Which is a piece coming out of some of my doctoral research where I was looking at kind of two parallel strains of discourse in the, throughout the 60s and early 70s, where artists and architects were kind of trying to engage the emerging sort of informational paradigm, how computation would change the way we think about space. So in this case, obviously, the model of circuitry, the circuit board, quite directly, the hardware gets instantiated as the sort of urban model for a floating offshore city. Others, Mark Wigley has talked about this extensively as well, not this project, but this idea of translating a network in the work of Archigram and some of the other 60s practices. And I started to look also at a parallel practice of engineers and artists who were collaborating. There was a group of people called Experiments in Art and Technology Organization who produced this pavilion for the 1970 Expo in Osaka. And strangely here, it's interesting, this morning, and I think yesterday as well, Alejandro Zarapola was talking about air and the kind of role of air in architecture. And this is a really sort of literal kind of instantiation of that, where the artificial stratus cloud starts to kind of undermine the legibility of this building itself. So again, it's looking at how things that are more ephemeral begin to erode the identity of the architecture. And this was also kind of accompanied by a series of kind of proto-interactive objects that would move in response to touch and recondition the way people kind of engaged on this plaza. So a very different kind of cloud of a sort of, this is the Passiflora lamp by Super Studio, again of the same time period, but looking at the notion of the figure of the cloud, so the word cloud getting translated both quite literally and one that is more sort of inscribed into a figure, a graphic figuration of that. And then the third example is the cybernetic sculptures of Wenying Tsai, who was really looking at how entities could be put into motion to produce a sort of multiple presence of a thing. And I think some of this relates oddly to recent discussions concerning object-oriented ontology and some of the stuff that Graham Harman talks about in terms of an object existing in multiple guises simultaneously. So going back to a very old project that Servo did for the non-standard architecture show at the Pompidou Center, one of our first projects that was really looking at the kind of coalescence, again, of the sort of hardware and things that are more ephemeral, in this case, light being phased through a series of plastic cells, and looking at the difference between a kind of literal inscription of a network and how that might then become confounded or undermined by the presence of light. Also how that would act as a kind of obstacle to circulation, something that relates to that Passiflora lamp, which is also often shown occupying the floor and presenting an obstacle to circulation, although it is a lighting fixture. So in this case, just diagrams showing how the kind of virtual agents that would trigger the lighting would circulate through this piece, and kind of local clouds of illumination would begin to obscure the clarity of the geometry. So shifting that onto another discussion about things that counter the clarity or legibility of a form or a geometry, we began to look at what maybe Alejandro would refer to as a multiple concept of nature, kind of problematizing that term. Grass above, glass around was Rainer Banham's glib characterization in a 1977 article of the same name of the binary aesthetic he observed in Norman Foster's building for the Willis, Faber, and Dumas headquarters in Ipswich, that we see here. The inscrutability of the building discussed by Banham in the context of both aesthetics and performance owes in part to the apparent energy wastefulness of curtain wall construction of the time, this is in the 70s, juxtaposed with the presence of growing turf on top of the roof of the building. So Banham's quote, "Turf on top of a high technology building full of air conditioning, escalators, computers and stuff, once again separated expectations. Different architectural languages have been shotgun married without apology or regard for the niceties of academic discourse, where turf is perfectly acceptable as long as it is on small windowed irregular, technologically low-profile buildings, like this one. Vernacular sod roof construction instigates varying degrees of imbalance between vegetal matter and the detail, decoration, and incident of the building type. The entropic tendencies of landscape partially obliterate the features of the architecture. It begins to become unruly and obscure, kind of the formal logic underlying it. So the separation of the synthetic and organic, or the biotic and abiotic, can be and has historically been considered in terms of entropy. The same year that Kisho Kurokawa formulated his equation between construction and minus entropy, Robert Smithson demonstrated the extreme entropic consequences, i.e. structural failure, of the coexistence of dirt, a backhoe, and an empty shed in his partially buried woodshed. So I think recent discussions sort of call into question how the issue of entropy might come into play, maybe in a different way, computationally, within an architectural space. So this is a project that we did for an exhibition at the Mack Center at the Schindler House called Genome. And the kind of brief for the exhibition was that each of the architects engaging in the space of the house would be kind of allocated a room. In our case, this was the nursery. And we should reflect on how digital technology could, in a sense, reconfigure the domestic space and how we use the domestic space. So we started to work literally off the wall because it's an historically protected structure. Nothing can be attached permanently, so we used suction to attach these cellular elements that would both act as a kind of shading device for the interior of the space, but they would also begin to transmit. So the idea was that the diagram of the hardware, as it were, as you can see in the section, kind of meanders from the exterior to the interior, in this sort of axon of that. And each cell was equipped with speakers and a photosensor and a small RF, a small microcontroller to communicate with cells in the adjacent area, so that as sunlight would move around the house, or as lighting levels on the interior would be changed, this would stimulate a reaction in one of the cells and thereby communicating to a neighboring cell. These are some of the diagrams of how there was a combination of both wireless and wired communication, as one sees here. And so these kind of 30 centimeter radii of stimulation would start to pass sound through the cellular modules. So in this case, instead of light, we were working with how the presence of a kind of soundscape could begin to sort of phase through the geometry and the formal logic. And that's just, and yes, it was Kimberly Meyer, who's the director there, was saying that actually every day when she came in to kind of open the exhibition, as the day passed, she would start to hear this thing kind of wake up and then again almost go to sleep as the shade started to hit that part of the house. So it was a way of looking at how something that was external could really be imported into the interior of the space. And a lot of that had to do with discussions at the time related to mood and atmosphere and how one could think of that, both through the luminosity that occurs when natural light is passing through these kind of translucent green cells. I mean, they were specifically designed that way to act as a kind of artificial vine, in a sense. Oops. Okay, so trope 2, abjection sustained. So this project it's a green roof project. It's for the Stockholm Resilience Center, and they asked us to design a kind of building, but more importantly, a literally they asked for a green roof because they wanted to sort of expose how a green roof could operate as something that is not just concealed from view and above one's head, but something that begins to become much more present in the interior space of the building. So this was on the outskirts of Stockholm in a former brownfield area. So here is the project taking position in a parcel that had been already kind of master planned, but looking at how we could create these different communities of vegetation that would thrive on a roofscape that had depressions and kind of protuberant areas that would produce differences between sort of wet, marshy vegetation and drier meadow vegetation. So again, the idea was that there is a sort of a micro scale of formal features that begin to engage with the vegetation in order to kind of work to start to kind of undermine the clarity of the geometric form. So the idea was to really embrace some of the entropic processes that might occur over time with this and how the vegetation would begin to kind of transform the initial formal strategy and how that could become visible through large apertures in the roof. So pulling down in places to provide structural support. This is a diagram of the roofscape itself with a series of these protuberant forms, that the bifurcation of the form in order to form auditorium space, office space below in the rear. This is a model of that, and again, the idea that some parts of the roof could be occupiable and would pull down to grade to meet the existing sidewalk. So the roof, again, is sort of two roofs that begin to overlap and provide access down to a ramp below to this auditorium. Diagrams showing how water was intended to collect. Again, part of the idea was that, typically we are sort of the first thing one is told is how to keep water off the building, and this was sort of looking at what would happen if we intentionally designed kind of places to collect the water. And just showing how these protuberances could work both to emit water and light during the night, different types of those. And again, the idea that the roof form, its morphology would form wells and hills, valleys and hills that would actually start to foster different kinds of plant communities. So the ecologists with whom we collaborated spec'd various forms of indigenous vegetation that really would be able to thrive in these areas. So part of this was also looking at how this could transform the kind of face of the building over time. So trope 3 is white paper. So a subset of gray literature is the white paper. The white paper is a definitive report or marketing document that delineates selected facts and arguments. The definitive nature of the white paper is of interest to us as a form of selective deception, raising the question of what is a fact or what might constitute an architectural fiction. So there's a quote from a writer, Aris Fioretis, who we've been interested in terms of a couple of these projects. He wrote a book called The Gray Book. The book is sort of situated in the genre between literary criticism and fiction. He was kind of making a transition in his career at the time that he wrote that. So hence the gray zone of that writing. So a quote from him that regards how we were thinking about this. It strikes us that such must be time's body, for it provides skin for every edge and exterior, shape for all extremities, contours for every convex and concave. Scrutinized more attentively, the objects in this forgotten place do not possess shape. Rather, it seems to be the dust that provides them with texture, emphasizing this flatness, creating that volume. So in our design vector interference for the sound art exhibition, More Than Sound at Bonniers Konsthall, the role of geometry is questioned through the legibility of lines, specifically the disappearance or emergence of the cusp. In architectural terminology, a cusp refers to a curved, triangular-shaped projection from the inner curve of an arch or circle. Geometrically, the cusp is the point where two arcs of a curve meet and intersect. A cusp is also defined as a change with far-reaching consequences, or significant consequences. Fluting in architecture, or flutes, are shallow, concave grooves running vertically on a column, pilaster, or other surface. Geological fluting is a process of differential weathering or erosion, a subtractive process that creates scalloped surfaces or parallel ridges and furrows. In vector interference, the shift between the architectural line and the geological line begins to produce ambiguity. So again, we were looking at the passiflora lamp, the idea here of the flute and cusp becoming kind of confounded into one object. The difference between the convex and the concave is the cusp. The cusp appears as an interruption or caesura between consecutive curves. The caesura appears to be definitive, but depending on its scale, can also be understood as a space or a gap. So in this project, a series of lines are generated as contours traced from grayscale images. These lines demarcate thresholds between light and dark areas, operating in a kind of penumbra. The rasterized image ceases to exist, being substituted solely with the lines, so these kind of contour lines that are traced off of the image. When the line is thickened, it begins to obliterate itself. The process of applying differential thickness to the line occludes information or reveals it. So we selected several of these lines to extrude and translate into a series of partially freestanding walls within the gallery. So kind of creating these local pieces. They were asking for something that would start to work with continuity in the gallery space because it was a sound art show, so they did not want anything obtrusive. So our initial ideas about actually attaching some of the line work to these walls were, that was not possible for them. It had to be very, very subdued and muted. They insisted on white. So we thought, okay, how can we begin to work with this idea of cusps that start to both punctuate the space, but also depending upon the illumination, again, how the exterior light and interior light are working in the space. The cusp here becomes nearly illegible. At other times, it is quite sharp and present. So the wall extrusions operated in the gray zone between tectonic and ornamental qualities of cusps and fluting. In this instance, the fluting shifts scale and orientation, producing thickened obstructions within the space of the exhibition. These extrusions were constructed as transitional zones to both fracture the space of the exhibition as well as to create different continuities between the areas of sound art. So trope 4 is blackening. Taking the cusp onto a different application. Again, another project that was primarily concerned with a roofscape and looking at how for this small lecture hall that of 1,000 square meter sort of multi-purpose lecture hall at the campus of the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, where I was also a visiting professor and where Ulrika teaches. We began to look at some of the town hall in Arles, some of the vaulting, the stereotomically derived vaults of Jules Hardouin-Mansart. And what was interesting to us about these was the way in which the grain of the stone both is very kind of blatantly revealed, but then the strangeness of the way in which it sort of breaches the larger cusps, and so you get this odd relationship between the edge of one stone and then the grain of the others, but then the actual change in the vault is occurring sometimes in a position which seems to not kind of align with that shifting grain. So we started to look at this in terms of how one could work with very simple subtractive techniques with CNC milling, almost in a kind of very basic way in starting to erode wood. So looking at what happens when differential sizes of milling bits get used to create this kind of interference between these small kind of cuts in the surface that begin to produce cusps. And the way in which that then translates into another, again, this is one of those active translation issues, that the tool path for that oddly starts to kind of produce these graphics which are sort of caricature-like in a sense. They begin to almost resemble the strange wood grain and the sort of circular position of that, even though it really has nothing to do with the materiality of the wood. It's just all about the translation of the surface into polygons. So oddly, also the discussion of hylomorphism that came up a couple times, I think today and last night with Alejandro and Jeff, that hyle, which is H-Y-L-E, which is the Greek word for wood, is kind of part of hylomorphism. So there was a play on that, the kind of form and matter discussion that can one do without the other. Starting to look at charring and blackening as a way of weatherproofing. This is a substance, Vantablack, which is has an extremely low index of refraction, and so basically makes the kind of possibility to see form or geometry within the space of Vantablack nearly impossible. So it starts to occlude that possibility. So here are some models for the roof where we began to take the micro cuts and work them across the scale of the larger cuts. Skylight in the center of that, the underside of this model. Diagram of the roof. Some of these are pretty faint, but and so you can see the lecture space, a small stair to below, small office space, and then a kind of flexible interior space. The roof was also to be populated with various mosses. So again, a kind of lichen and moss, very low maintenance roofscape that over time very slowly would start to take on different colorful aspects. So these are just some images of that. Trope 5 is rustication. So this is a project where we were looking at the idea of rustication and how to sort of update that in terms of a digital context. The idea of making rustic, I mean, again, this relates to another class that I recently taught with Ramiro Diaz-Granados, an applied studies class, thinking about how certain forms of the rustic could be made more contemporary. So in this case, looking at what's called vermiculate rustication, which is this sort of worm form, hence it's named vermiculate, that form of rustication, and then looking at the sort of diamond-pointed block of rustication, beginning to take that onto a scale where the diamond point becomes part of the massing of this project. This is a mixed-use commercial, well, there's a small cafe in the ground floor, and some shops on this end, and several stories of residential space. This is for a small town Katrina home in Stockholm, that in Sweden, that was looking for a building to complete the central square and kind of buffer the square from the adjacent railway. So the idea was to look at this as a kind of series of these large, almost rusticated ashlar pieces that then get accentuated in unlikely places where the rustication starts to migrate across the whole building mass rather than being placed closest to the ground to suggest stability. And this begins to kind of also undermine some of the legibility of the architectural features, so some of the fenestration. These are just some sections, plans. So trope 6 is graining. That's the last trope. So again, the idea of the line, in this case, these are the lines coming from the Blockterräng project that I just showed, and then migrating into another kind of series of lines. This is actually a photograph by Russell Thompson. I think Russell's here somewhere. From the exhibition that we did here at SCI-Arc a couple of years ago called Aqueotrope. And so in this case, again, there was a discussion about how the sort of what is the role of geometry, what is the role of the drawing in relation to a set of objects that could be assumed to be derived from it. So we sort of took some of the discussion that started with the hydrophile project about these protuberant forms on the roof and said, well, what if we could construct a series of three-dimensional tiles that would be designed to shed water. In this case, the tiles are on the floor of the gallery. So rather than mocking up a roofscape in the gallery, we decided to actually use them to form another kind of almost garden space within the space of the gallery, and then to create a conflation between the various constituents in the show. So the drawings are all based on Boolean addition and Boolean subtraction. The addition for the tiles, this is some of the line work that comes out of very simple operations in Rhino, just kind of Boolean union, but the way in which the geometry becomes assigned line weights, it actually confounds the idea of a contour or a section or an elevation. So the drawing really, its status kind of floats between the conventions of architectural notation, and it starts to suggest something that is, I think, much more fluctuating in nature. Specifically, we worked with different shades of gray to begin to, again, occlude some of the clarity of the line work. And so some of these were extremely dark, others were lighter, where you could actually read the geometric primitive quite clearly. And again, we thought it was important that the drawing would be present. I mean, these are just some of the I'll flick through the process really quickly, but the idea that also there were groupings of these, that they were designed to either be moved into positions where smaller tiles could be separated from the ensemble or larger connections could be made. So just a process of silicone jacket molding, very thick silicone molds into which the concrete is poured. And then we were looking at actually introducing sort of impurities into the mix in order to create this kind of cracking, different forms of cracking, so that water and root systems, I mean, again, these are meant to be sort of hydrodynamic tiles, so water should flow through these in rivulets, and roots should anchor into them. There's just a whole range of different views from that exhibition. Here, the subtractive geometry for the lamps. So again, it's the same geometric primitive. The whole show is modular, but we were really interested, going back to some of our earlier work where the modular quality is quite apparent. In this case, it's super simple and modular, but the different orientations of these and the different way in which material is treated. So the blowing of glass, where it starts to exceed the mold, so the CNC milled foam, and then you get a plaster negative mold with very subtle features that we were really curious, would these things pick up? They actually did, in fact, depending upon how the glass is blown. There we see that same feature. In order to sometimes kind of exceed the confines of the mold. So pushing the legibility of that geometry to a point where it's no longer legible. And then, of course, the difference between clear glass and clouded glass actually accentuated that quality. Just go very fast here through these. And so, again, this sort of notion of this kind of strange gray archipelago that occupies the floor and the orbicular forms of light in the lamps suspended above. There is also the idea of the cable sargassum, taking up from sort of cable spaghetti images, and one has too many servers. Going back again to Kisho Kurokawa, some of his diagrams for urban form, metabolist diagrams, some of the paintings of Albert Oehlen, like really fascinating kind of bringing together of forms that are digitally driven and forms that appear to be more analog. So in the suspended trellis, we were looking at how the lighting fixtures for the 21 lamps could be, rather than kind of neat and tidy, could start to actually be organized in a way that would form a canopy and that would also deal with excess, disorder, entropy. So that was part of the workshop of the SCI-Arc students who participated in this workshop, to start to look at how that could be designed and still, obviously function as a kind of lighting network. So there are some familiar faces. And I'll just quickly, in closing, play a video of that. Since we are at SCI-Arc, I figured it might be nice to show this. Oops. And this video is by Ryan Tyler Martinez, who's here with us tonight as well. Thank you.